This year we're beginning our lecture evening with a reading from literature, and tonight's selection is one that I think I wish we had read last week for Bill Wissner's presentation. But this poem is called Water Table. It's by Billy Collins, one of my favorite poets. Water Table. It is on dry, sunny days like this one that I find myself thinking about the enormous body of water that lies under this house. Cool, unseen reservoir, silent except for the sounds of dripping and the incalculable shifting of all the heavy darkness that it holds. This is the water that our well was dug to sip and lift to where we live. Water drawn up and falling on our bare shoulders. Water filling the inlets of our mouths. Water in a pot on the stove. The house is nothing now but a blueprint of pipes, a network of faucets, nozzles, and spigots, and even outdoors where light pierces the air and clouds fly over the canopies of trees, my thoughts flow underground, trying to imagine the cavernous scene. Surely it is no pool with a colored ball floating on the blue surface. No grotto where a king would have his guests rowed around in swan-shaped boats. Between the dark lakes where the dark rivers flow, there is no ferry waiting on the shore of rock, and no man holding your last coin. This is the real earth and the real water it contains. But some nights, I must tell you, I go down there after everyone has fallen asleep. I swim back and forth in the echoing blackness. I sing a love song as well as I can, lost for a while in the home of the rain. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the fifth in our series of lectures. In our 16th annual series. I want to remind you, as always, about your telephones. I want to remind you to go over and see the art in Mansfield Library and also in the President's office. I think that's going to be there straight through April, so you'll have a chance to go over if you can get on campus during those opening hours. I think instead of taking a whole lot of time talking about Lisa, because I'm going to let Lisa talk a little bit about herself, I want to just say one thing, and that is I think we have most of the members of the advisory council of the community lecture series here tonight. I just saw two of them walk in who usually aren't here. I'm just going to ask you to stand up as I call your name, if you don't mind, and let's give everybody a round of applause for working on this. First, Jeff Badnock. Stand up, Jeff. Second, Ann Boone. Ann and Tom just came in. Welcome back. Chris Comer, Dean of the College of Humanities and Science. I don't believe Tiffany Erickson is here. Is Tiffany here? Don Hobby? Don around? Don? No. And Kitty Robbins, also I just saw a moment ago. Kitty, if you'd stand up. Thanks, everybody. Okay, so tonight we have Lisa Eby. She's an ecologist. Like everybody in this series, I guess she works with a whole lab filled with people. So Bill was saying all last week, we do this kind of thing. And in humanities, we just sit in our little studies and look at our little books. So Lisa, come on up and tell us what you and your lab group are working on. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Whoa. Hi. All right. Can everyone hear? If it gets too loud, just let me know. I've been known to be a loud person. All right. So I'm going to actually, during my talk, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the work that we're doing, but there's a lot of work. I'm going to be using we a lot, because not only do I work with my graduate students who are much of the workhorse of universities in the natural sciences, but I also collaborate a lot with all the state and federal agencies locally, as well as some nonprofit groups. So when I say we, I mean we, much more than me. All right, so there we go. What I wanted to do is sort of start with this idea of the Western water and the linking of people, landscapes, and livelihood to water. And some of the best images in the world are some of these images that come from the NASA satellites. And this is just the Nile River Valley at night. That really just highlights the linking of how people use water, how we're so tied in our distribution into our where we can live to water. Not surprising, this is the Nile River Valley right here. And even though Egypt's a much broader country, they're all focused around the Nile River Valley. And that's obviously just a neat photo from my perspective, but it's also something that we've seen a lot in the West. And this is just, again, a picture of the Columbia River Valley, just highlighting that every town is along a waterway because of transportation, historic commerce, but also because of the fisheries resources that were so important driving these settlements. And even today, as we're thinking about this, people flock to rivers of Montana, both in-state and out-of-state, to recreate, to fish, to float, to relax, and spend some time. And so I'm just going to ask a question here. There's going to be some audience participation. I love the fact that Bill had audience participation last week. So how many people fish? Raise your hand. All right, quite a few people. That's actually probably about a third to maybe even a half of the audience. And if you look at the tours or the report from the state, about a third of in-state people fish. So this is pretty typical. All right, so some of the stuff I'll say for those of you who fish may seem obvious. For those of you who don't, may not. And so today what I really wanted to do is talk about riverscapes in flux. How have riverscapes historically been changed? How are we changing them? And what this means for native fish. And in order to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about how fish use these broad streams and rivers, these riverscapes, and try to link it in to some of the stuff that Bill talked about last week. How we've historically transformed the physical environment, and then what are we doing today? And in some of these cases, we're restoring the environment and fish are gaining ground, and in some cases, we have some work to do. And not only are we transforming the physical environment, but riverscapes are transformed from a biotic community component. There's a lot of non-native and exotic species on the landscape that can create challenges and opportunities. And then I'm going to say that one of the things in the future that we're looking towards is trying to understand how riverscapes will be changing into the future, in particular with climate change and what this might mean. We're kind of changing the playing field for some of these fish. And so to start, whenever you're thinking about riverscapes or what fish require, I just like to start going through the life stages because it's an easy, very sort of, I don't know, logical way to think about it. And so certainly if we think about spawners, and I'm going to use bull trout as an example, one, because Bill used them last week, so hopefully you'll remember some of this. And also because they're really using the landscape at multiple scales, so they're a great example of this. So if we think about bull trout spawning, bull trout get together, they spawn over cobble and gravel and make these redds, which Bill showed last week, and this is where they get together. They move across the rocks, all the fine sediment and the algae, and then they lay their eggs in that substrate. Typically, bull trout are spawning in this mid to high elevation zone of watersheds, and they have some pretty specific requirements. They have some pretty specific habitat preferences. And just to remind you that where they place these redds typically are in these upwelling zones, like Bill talked about. So these areas that are gaining reaches, where groundwater is coming into this general reach. And bull trout are fall spawners. So what this does is it brings that warmer groundwater this more consistent, warmer environment for the eggs to develop in over the winter. And then specific site placement within that reach tends to be at these pool riffle breaks. And so even though it's an upwelling section, as water is moving down, it's actually moving down into the red. And so that's pushing water, oxygenated fresh water, across the eggs, keeping them from being silted, helping them stay oxygenated, removing metabolic wastes. So they're making these selections based on this groundwater, surface water connection. That's really important at the landscape scale, especially for spawning fish, and in particular for spawning bull trout. Then after the larvae grow up a little bit, we call them juveniles. So juvenile rearing habitat can be really important. We think a lot about structure for juvenile rearing, whether it's this large wood. This is kind of an extreme example of large wood in a stream. Undercut banks, as well as connection between the river channel itself and off-channel habitat or floodplains, whether they're off-channel habitat or sloughs. A lot of juveniles use this habitat. They're getting away from big fish. They're getting away from high flows. They're warm, productive areas that are critical for nursery grounds in many species. And so this floodplain main channel connection is really important for this life stage. And certainly as we're thinking about the scale that they're using on, it's this broader scale. They may spawn at a particular spot, but as they get bigger, they're moving around and using a larger part of the tributary. And then as fish get even bigger, we think about other key habitat components. And some key river processes that are really important is enough flow to scour out and create pools, and groundwater and surface water interactions interacting with these pools and these riffles. And when we think about how fish use habitat, pools, if you fish, you know fish likes to hang out in pools. They're big fish in particular, love to hang out in pools. Riffles can be important for juvenile fish because big fish aren't there. But also, riffles are really important because they produce fish food. And so, as an aquatic ecologist, I think not only about fish, but about the stoneflies, caddisflies, and mayflies, these areas that are super important. So how many people have turned over a rock in a stream? Raise your hand. All right, so you know what I'm talking about. You turn over a rock and it's just crawling around with stoneflies, caddisflies, and mayflies, and it's great. And so as a fish biologist, I just call it fish food. But these are really important, this habitat diversity. The connections to the floodplain, having both pools and riffles on the landscape are critical. The other thing when we're thinking about feeding and refuge is, again, when we're thinking about the surface water groundwater interaction. One of the things in Montana is sometimes the summers get very hot and water temperatures get really hot. And fish pile up in pools where there's groundwater inflow or at the end of some of these tributaries. One of the things Ron Pierce has seen is fish move from the Blackfoot up to the bottom of Gold Creek there because there's a nice gaining reach, and it's nice and cool that fish can stack up and have a refuge from hot temperatures as well as cold temperatures in the winter. So certainly we can think about these connections being really important and working across different scales, from the site scale to the tributary scale. And then not only do fish use these tributaries, but as many of you know, even though they spawn in tributaries, they move into rivers for overwintering and foraging habitat. And this connection is critical, and it's critical because rivers grow big fish. And so when we're really thinking about fish not only as reproductively sustainable and being able to make a lot of eggs, but also being useful and productive as a fishery, it's really important that fish have access to these rivers so they can grow big and can be caught by those of you who fish. All right, so certainly when we're thinking about connections, it's connections within the tributary, having some of these functioning groundwater, surface water interactions, connections between floodplains, as well as connections between the tributary and the river. So when people think about fish habitat, they think about it across multiple scales. These particular site scales, what's happening at these pools and riffles, what's happening between these sections and the floodplains. Do we have connections for fish to meet their life history needs within the tributary during the first few years and then into the river? And the last sort of level of connection that folks, fish biologists, really think about are connections between tributaries. And so even though many of our fish return to their natal site to spawn, so they return to where they were born and spawn there, there are a few strays that go somewhere else and disperse to other populations. And this is really important to have this connection to maintain genetic connectivity, or if something happens to a watershed, these dispersers really help rescue that population from very low levels, kind of give them a boost and allow them to recover. So when we think about what this means in terms of human transformation of rivers, historically we've spent a lot of time channelizing and straightening streams and rivers. And again, this is going to disconnect the river from the floodplain and also decrease the diversity of habitat that's available to fish. And we also fragment rivers, and so we stop movement corridors. So fish, this is Kerr Dam, that fish can't move through. And not only do dams stop fish, but they stop all the sediment, the wood that's coming down this river, and really change the habitat characteristics below it. And depending on whether that water is withdrawn from the top of the reservoir, where there's sun is shining on it and it's nice and warm, or the bottom of the reservoir, which typically is cold, you can really change the temperature that is of the river below where the reservoir water is spilling over. So certainly these dams are really changing the habitat that fish live within. And we're also changing these smaller tributaries quite a bit through erosion, through dewatering, through making it so that culverts aren't passable, so that fish can't move to spawning areas. And certainly, although I haven't seen a number from Montana, people have mapped out in Washington the amount of high quality habitat that fish can't get to anymore because of culverts or some sort of barriers, and it's over 5,000 miles of habitat. So we're really affecting the production potential of some of these populations if they can't get to their spawning habitat. So certainly we've talked a lot about, well, not a lot, we've talked a little bit about how fish use these riverscapes at different scales and what we've done. But I really want us to think about not just given what we've done, sort of how are we transforming these landscapes currently, and specifically ask where native fish are gaining ground. And one place native fish are gaining ground is in our value of them. And so this is a quote from a Montana State and Game Commission report from 1913. And so it says, if the Dolly Varden or bull trout should be classified as a non-game fish, its destruction would be a good thing. And so in the early 1900s, there are eradication programs for bull trout. And up into the late up into the late 1900s, there were actually bounties on bull trout in some areas. So certainly that's a very different value of bull trout than we have today, where we've spent a lot of time on protecting the bull trout, and we're almost proud of this is bull trout country in the Blackfoot, as if it's a positive thing, right? And so our value of this fish as a society has changed. Now there's individuals, I admit, that still feel like bull trout are a trash fish, okay? I'm not saying everyone feels the same way. I'm saying as a society, we've changed our value. And then the other thing we can think about is that some of the other native fish, like cutthroat trout, are being promoted. So when you think about the Fly Fishing magazine, come to Montana and fish for cutthroat. This is something that's, again, being promoted as a good thing. So certainly the value of native fish have changed over time. And not surprising, as a result, we're doing different things on the landscape that will promote native fish. One such issue has to do with many of the state dams. In Montana, there's 2,880 state dams, and by 2020, 85% will be beyond their life expectancy. So there's a lot of decisions that the state has to deal with either upgrading these dams, fixing dams, relicensing dams, or removing them. And this is a big sort of thing that the state's going to be currently dealing with, is going to be dealing with. And in one area, we were able to work with the Forest Service and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks on a project regarding Emily A. Dam. This is the Clearwater River, or this is the Clearwater River here, Clearwater Junction. This is where the big cow is. Yeah, right? Everyone knows the big cow, right? And so, this is an area that some decisions had to be made for dams. And Emily A. Dam was above Sealy Lake, below Alva and Inez, and Rainy Dam is below Rainy Lake, but above Alva. And this is an area that they knew that there were migratory bull trout left in. Lad Notek at Fish, Wildlife, and Parks had done a fair amount of work looking at Morel Creek, knowing that there were some nice migratory bull trout there. But they weren't really sure what the costs and benefits of removing these dams are. So that's something that we were able to work with, have a graduate student start to look at and work with the Forest Service and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And so what do we do? Well, the first thing we did, and this is where the royal we really comes in, because this is Aubrey Benson, a graduate student, and this is Lad Notak, and this is the bottom of Emily A. Even though we built a little fish ladder here to catch bull trout did not go up this fish ladder because of the lack of attractant flow compared to what was happening at the dam. And so we had to rely on the good method of just angling to catch bull trout. And as it turns out, I am really, really bad at that. So I was more of a hindrance than a help in the capturing of bull trout. So I got delegated to a photographer. So here we are, we have capturing bull trout. And then again, this is Shane Hendricks at US Forest Service. This is Lad cut off. And Aubrey implanting a radio tag into fish. And then for 2 years, we moved the fish over the dams, some of them over the dams, some of them not over the dams, and then tracked them to find out where they went and what happened. And so every time she located a fish, she tried to get a visual of it. And this is the little antenna that comes out of the bottom of the fish, so she could track it. And it sends a radio signal to this receiver, right? And so, and she tracked a lot of them to where they were spawning. You can tell we have a lot of fish pictures with little antennas sticking out of them, but you could hardly tell unless you know. So one of the things we found is that for fish that moved over these dams, they went to Marshall Creek, West Fork Creek, and some of them tried to go all the way up to Rainy. And for fish that we moved over Rainy, they went to East Fork. So we located 3 other spawning areas in the watershed. And we also were able to detect for the fish that we moved over, that did not get moved over the dam, whether the dams were a complete barrier or not. And then we were also able to survey what other fish were in this region. Are there any fish that we might not want to move up this watershed? And so ultimately what we found is that after snorkeling during spawning times and visual counts of fish on reds, 50% of the fish that spawned in Marshall, West Fork, and East Fork were fish that we had passed over the dams. That's a high percentage, and not surprising, the 2 years we passed fish, red counts were substantially higher than they were before. We also found Emily A. Was a barrier to bull trout all year, so it was completely impassable. But Rainy Dam was passable in high flow years, but it was a barrier to exotic fish species such as northern pike. And so this helped Lad, who's kind of the hero of implementation. The great thing in the university is we can create data, we can answer questions, and we can provide information to managers, and then they have to do all the hard work, getting stuff done on the ground. And so Emily A. was removed, and Rainy Dam actually had a higher step so that bull trout would be able to pass it at higher flows, but because of the potential stopping of northern pike at Rainy, they decided not to completely remove the barrier, to try to keep it what I would say passable to bull trout, but not passable to pike. The other thing that was useful for this project is the laying out of all the bull trout spawning habitat, because if those of you who are aware, both the Marshall Creek and West Fork got put into the Montana Legacy Project because of its importance to bull trout habitat. So this is a success story that for the actual on-the-ground success, we need to be thanking the managers out there who are really doing the work. But it's a success story where native fish are really gaining ground. And if you look at Western Montana, there's a lot of good people working really hard in the Clark Fork Coalition and agencies and the Blackfoot Challenge. And we work a little bit with these groups, evaluating restoration with Ron and primarily. But there's a lot of success stories. There's a lot of places that we're reconnecting these habitats, whether it's improving riparian zones, getting more water in the stream, or decreasing fragmentation. But, of course, there's also places where progress is limited. And in particular in eastern Montana, the pallid sturgeon is a species that there's still a long way to go. The pallid sturgeon is an endangered species. How many of you have seen a pallid sturgeon? Actually held one in your hands? You are the lucky few. These are ancient relics. Pallid sturgeon were around in the dinosaurs. They are neat, neat fish. They get big. They get 60 pounds, over 5 feet. If maybe you held a little baby pallid sturgeon in a hatchery. No, but if you held an adult one, it's an event. It's a bucket list event, really. These are fish that live a long time. Females don't mature until they're 15 to 20 years old. They live till they're 80 to 100. And when they do reproduce, they can produce hundreds of thousands of eggs, about 150,000 or so people are estimating. And so these are just neat, neat animals. And if we look at their distribution in Montana, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, because they're listed, and Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks do work together on them. And they estimate there's about 50 fish in this section of the river and about 120 fish in this fork right around the Yellowstone. That's it in Montana. And I saw a report, I was reading a report recently, they think that the average pallid sturgeon existing here is already 60 years old. So this is a population that needs some help. So what's going on with pallid sturgeon? Well, the issue is pallid sturgeon need really long distances to complete their life cycle. And so this is what the river that they use looks like, and here are some dams. And when we think about pallid sturgeon spawn in the spring, so they're triggered by high flows and warm temperatures as spring runoff comes, and they might migrate 200, 300 kilometers to their spawning areas. And then once they spawn, little larvae are attached to rocks just for a few days, and then they drift downstream. And they drift downstream anywhere from 100 to 200 kilometers. And so these are really long distances that this species needs to complete its life cycle. And so that's where they run into trouble. And so when they think about what's happening with pallid sturgeon, some concerns are associated with spawning queues. Because we're not releasing a lot of water from some of these dams along this, along the Missouri, that they don't have the peak flows that are trigger spawning. And they're also releasing cold water from the bottom of the reservoir versus the top. So in some cases, they're seeing delays in spawning migrations. And in some cases, fish just can't get to their spawning grounds. And then if fish do spawn, their larvae drift down, and they end up drifting into big reservoirs where they get eaten or aren't able to survive. And so really, it's the fact that they need such long, long river distances that is a problem. And so if we look at Montana and what the recovery plan entails, certainly U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service built a bunch of hatcheries, and they take eggs from pallid sturgeon, and they grow them up. And they've done a great job with this, and they release them to try to keep the population alive. But without successful recruitment, that's really just a Band-Aid, unless we're going to keep doing that in perpetuity until we decide to stop or we run out of money. And so there are other options that people are talking about. One is, this is Fort Peck, is increasing spring flows in Fort Peck to try to mimic the natural hydrograph. And in a lot of dam relicensings, this is something that's coming up, is the importance of mimicking these natural flows in the spring in particular for river processes is key. But the problem is we've been in a drought. We don't have a lot of water in Fort Peck except for a couple flood years. And so the question is, how feasible is that in the long term? And then another issue, which really Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is really, I would argue, they're considering is the best hope, is even though you hear about the Yellowstone River being the longest undammed river in the lower 48, there's still a number of diversion structures. There's still walls across the river that are 6 to 12 feet high that are diverting water for irrigation. So they're not truly dams, but they're certainly fragmenting the landscape in many ways. And so this is something that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has really been trying to push forward on the Corps of Engineers, is at this point at the intake dam trying to make it passable to pallid sturgeon. And that's a big push. That's been a big push for a long time, and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is still working on it. But it's something that is sort of, you know, certainly worth moving forward on or trying if you value pallid sturgeon. The other reason they think that's a good option is because if pallid sturgeon can get past this point, there would be enough distance for a typical migration and then larval drift before they hit the reservoir. So they think that could create enough habitat for these fish to complete their life cycle. So we don't know. There's a lot of good things that are happening in many places in western Montana, but certainly we have some unknowns about the future of pallid sturgeon. And this is just from a Montana Outdoors. A whisker away from winking out. Will pallid sturgeon go extinct on our watch? We will wait and see. Probably not extinct on our watch, but certainly there's things we could do to increase their likelihood of persistence. So we've talked a little bit about the good. We've talked a little bit about the bad. Now I want to bring up the ugly. So, and what I mean by that is this kind of fish. So people working with the Forest Service, graduate student in my lab just described a new species of sculpin, and the reporter repeatedly called it ugly. So I'm going to call them ugly. This is the good. We've talked about the bad. And what about all these ugly fish? And so one of the things we think about is, are we too focused? Oh my goodness. Sorry. Are we too focused on the big, sexy species? And you think about this when you think about pandas and lions, but I'm going to bring it into fish. And when you think about who's the big, sexy species here, it would be the bull trout. And, you know, bull trout, I would argue, deserve the big, sexy species label. The question is, we think about them as an umbrella species, a species that if we conserve because it's sensitive and because it requires a large space to conserve, are we doing a good job conserving other species by focusing only on the bull trout? And so an umbrella species is one where if we say we're going to focus on this one species, we're going to protect all these other species as a result. We're going to be able to protect the community in our western rivers if we can keep bull trout sort of going. And we are. So the question is that true? And that's something my ugly student here, who's here, Michael Moyne, is working on, is he's focused on some of these small species. He's looking at sculpin. He's looking at darter, in particular, a little bit in mountain whitefish, to say, well, if we really manage for conservation of bull trout, how do these other species, how are their habitat requirements different? So if we do conserve bull trout, are they going to be covered? And how might their movements and capabilities be different in terms of movement? Bull trout can jump. I mean, they're not pretty. They're not like Pacific salmon. They're more floppy, but they can jump. Whereas sculpin don't have a swim bladder. They're stuck to the bottom. They can't jump. So barriers that aren't, or things that aren't barriers to bull trout are barriers to some of these smaller species. And the question is, do we need to worry about it? So one of the things he's going back to is a lot of historical records and really trying to think about what it is that we're missing by focusing on some of these trout. All right. So we've talked about transformations in the physical community, or in the physical habitat of rivers and places that we're gaining. I want to talk a little bit about transformations in the biotic community. And I think it's really important that we think about this because humans are moving species around at unprecedented rates across the world, and certainly across Montana. And this is something that people are aware of. The state legislature even was aware of it when they provided money to fish, wildlife, and parks to help stop aquatic hitchhikers deal with this aquatic invasive species sort of potential problem. And so one of the things that people are worried about is not just, well, a whole variety of aquatic invasive species, and can we prevent it? And so they're worried about algae, they're worried about aquatic plants, worried about mussels. This is just a picture of a zebra mussel, something people are very worried about getting into the state. Snails, as well as disease, as well as other fish. And when you think about whether this is something we really need to worry about, this I thought was very intriguing. This is from the report of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in 2012, where they looked at the boat check stations and they tracked their zip code from their license, so where they came from. So this is a map of all the people who are driving their trailers into Montana waters. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? So we are getting people into Montana waters from all over North America. So which is exciting, but also why folks are very concerned about it. And so certainly there's a lot of effort to prevent new invasions and catch new invasions right before they really catch invaders before they take off. So I want to do a little quick quiz with you guys. This is another audience participation time to wake up. We have native and exotic fish present in Montana. And I'm just going to quiz you on whether you know if they're native or exotic. So, do people know what this fish is? Call it out. Lake trout, right? So I put a picture of like a big fishy boat on a lake just now. All right, are lake trout native or exotic? Right, exotic. All right. Who knows what this fish is? Brook trout. I would like to highlight the worm-like. No, it's on the top. Raise your hand if you think it's native. Raise your hand if you think it's exotic. Raise your hand if you have no idea. Brook trout are from eastern Montana and got moved over here. All right. What do you think this is? Rainbow trout. Everybody knows the rainbow trout. All right. Raise your hand if you think it's native. Raise your hand if you think it's exotic. Raise your hand if you don't know. All right. So throughout most of Montana, rainbow trout are exotic. They've been stocked here from the West Coast as hatcheries. The only, and I say most, there's a little qualifier, the only exception is in the Kootenai drainage where there's red band rainbow. Red band rainbow are native. All right. All right. Who's this? This is a cutthroat trout. You can barely see. So how many people think this is native? How many people think it's exotic? How many people don't know? All right. It is native. This is the last one, I promise. All right. What do you guys think? What is this? Brown trout. Lovely trout. These are really pretty in the fall. So how many people think this is native? How many people think this is exotic? How many people don't know? All right. Brown trout came from Europe and were stocked in the late 1800s. Most of these fish were stocked in the late 1800s into Montana waters, purposely. All right. So certainly we have a mix of fish, both native fish and exotic fish in our waterways. And even though I focused a lot on talking about native fish, and we'll talk more about native fish, we need to realize that a lot of our fisheries are based on exotic fish, which creates this joint push and pull in management of our fisheries. We want to protect our native fish, but we also want to create a strong, good fisheries, which often are based on these exotic species. So when we think about these fish, we can think about the effects of previous introductions on some of our native populations. And I'm just going to focus as an example on cutthroat trout. And so cutthroat trout are a native species that are found throughout Montana, or have been found throughout Montana historically. And these species can be impacted by lake trout, right? You guys know the story of Yellowstone Lake, where lake trout are causing declines in the Yellowstone cutthroat trout. They can also be eaten by brown trout. They can be outcompeted by brook trout. And rainbow trout is sort of a neat story, so I'm going to spend a little more time talking about that. So West Slope cutthroat trout hybridize or reproduce with the stocked rainbow trout. So you have a cutthroat trout, mates up with a rainbow trout. They produce an offspring, a hybrid. Often we call them cut bows. You hear about cut bows in the rivers. That's what this is, cut bow. And these cut bows are fertile. They can mate with a cutthroat, parental type. They can successfully mate with a rainbow. They can successfully mate with themselves. And they all just mate together and create a big hybrid population, a big cut bow population. And so the question is, you guys see cut bows in the rivers a lot, right? In a lot of our systems, we have these hybridized fish from historical stocking of rainbow trout. And certainly some people are concerned because we're losing the pure cutthroat trout. We're losing that genome. It's going through some sort of genome extinction in some watersheds. But really the question is, should we care, right? I mean, we could care because we care about this pure cutthroat that's out there, but also we might care for other reasons. But we don't really know what the effects of this hybridization are. We don't even know if hybrids are that different than West Slope cutthroat trout. Are there differences in life history between these fish? Do they do different things on the landscape? Are they different in their vital rates? Do they grow to a different size? Do they create different number of eggs? So they would have different population parameters? Do they have lower survival? These are big scale questions that if we're having hybridization, we're making the decision of whether we should care, whether we should try to protect pure cutthroats, would often come at the cost of isolating them versus hybrid fish. Should we be managing for them? Should we be managing against them? We don't know because we don't really know what they are and what they're doing. We need science, right? And so some of the work that we've done is we've worked with the Salish and Kootenai tribes, in particular Craig Barfoot here, and a graduate student, Matt Corsi, where we've looked at migration timing of this range of rainbows to West Slope cutthroat trout. And so this is just looking at how fish move up tributaries, so when they're migrating for spawning versus the hydrograph. So this is discharge. So this is high flows here, and then the descending limb of the hydrograph. And so what this study and other studies have found is that fish that are almost rainbows migrate on the ascending limb of the hydrograph as flows are coming up, and cutthroat migrate at high and down along the descending limb. And in some systems, this is kept fairly separate reproductive populations with some overlap, but not always. Certainly, you see a lot of overlap. And then hybrids, these low hybrid fish that are back-crossed or reproduced with cutthroats, migrate intermediate in between. And in some cases, once you get hybridization, then these fish can reproduce with either parental type. So it allows these hybrid genes to progress. And often this is sort of the most extreme. We looked at this over 5 years. This is the most separated. Some of these hybrids reproduce almost the entire range of both species. We can also look at how much they grow. And in this case, you need to look at size of the fish versus age of the fish. And so what we did is we looked at size of the fish versus age of the fish, and we found that fish that are close to rainbows or even back-crossed into rainbows grow faster than cutthroats or even fish that have back-crossed into cutthroat. So rainbow trout and highly hybridized fish have a higher growth rate, but they're also spawning lower in the watershed where it's warmer and more productive. The other thing we found is that even though they're bigger, they actually have fewer eggs. And so this is looking at the size of the fish versus the log of the fecundity, which is number of eggs produced. And this is no introgression, low, so no rainbow genes, just a few rainbow genes because they're back-crossed in a cutthroat, and ones that look and have a genotype very similar to rainbows. And so what you see is even at a given size, some of those rainbows and highly hybridized fish have lower number of eggs. And this is actually even very intriguing. So this is work that was done by Clint Mulfeld, and who is a USGS biologist, but also affiliated with our program. And this is looking at, out of the adults that reproduce, you can track their offspring. And so you can look at how many offspring are produced per female. And what they found is that this is done in a small creek off the Flathead River, that West-Slope cutthroat were producing a lot more offspring, and as you went more towards rainbow, fewer and fewer offspring per individual were being produced. So this implies that in some cases, maybe hybrids have lower number of eggs and are producing fewer females. So maybe there is some cost to this hybridization. But as we're thinking about this conservation of West-Slope cutthroat, people are thinking about making trade-offs between these pure populations, which in many cases to maintain purity they have to be isolated, versus maintaining large connected systems and a good fishery, right? And this is the balancing act that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is trying to do across the landscape. In some places they're working on conserving cutthroats. They're isolating cutthroats, or cutthroats that are isolated and are pure. They're trying to increase their habitat. And in some areas they're managing them for sports fishing, right? So they really are trying to maintain this balance between maintaining this pure species but also creating a good fishery. And in particular, this hybridization problem creates this conundrum. And this is something that people are still looking into. What are the ecological and evolutionary effects of hybrids? You know, maybe they have different temperature tolerances. Maybe they'll be more productive into the future. So these are some of the things that folks are working on at the University of Montana. All right. So certainly, as we're reflecting on transforming the system, transforming the physical habitat, one of the things we have to think about is what's going to happen in the future. Are we really changing the playing field? Is our understanding today really going to be useful as we're moving into the future? And so when we're thinking about climate change, we can think about, we expect in many cases less snow and more rain, so more winter flooding. We might expect warmer surface temperatures, and we're already seeing this in many western rivers. Lower base flows. So in many cases, we're seeing, at least even to this point, slightly warmer rivers in some cases. This is complicated, and this is where surface water, groundwater interactions are going to be super important as we understand refuges for native fish and areas that we should be focusing on. And then the other thing that people are seeing are more wildfires, actually larger, more severe wildfires. And we know that wildfires can, if you've been down in the Bitterroot, can really change the dynamics of a stream. They can burn all the riparian vegetation, you have more solar radiation, you have more sunlight hitting the stream, and you can get warmer temperatures there as well. And so there's a lot of people making a lot of predictions about what this is going to mean for native fish. This is just some work that's come out of the Rocky Mountain Research Labs in Idaho, where they're talking about how current suitable habitat is going to change into really teeny little bits of isolated habitat for bull trout, primarily at these high elevation systems. And so something we wanted to do is say, hey, if this is really happening, we're already seeing some changes in river systems. Can we detect any changes in distribution of bull trout? And is this occurring in association with wildfires, or is this just occurring in association with stream temperature? And so one of the places we wanted to work, because we were really thinking about wildfire as well, is the Bitterroot. Because in 2000, the Bitterroot burned, and has burned since then, but it's a great place to work on wildfire, because it's seen its fair share. And so we have a number of projects looking at how fish respond to wildfire, and this is just one of them that we're doing with folks at the Rocky Mountain Research Lab, the Fire Center, and graduate students. And what we did is we went back and revisited a bunch of sites that were sampled in 1992 in order to understand, are bull trout still there? Has there been any change in distribution? Is this a site that bull trout were found in 92 but not found today? Is there a site that there were no bull trout in 1992 and they were found today? What's really happening with this presence of bull trout across the landscape, and is it associated with anything like temperature or fire? And so what we found is that overall, these site level extirpations, these losses at the site level, is something that we're seeing at a higher rate than colonizations. And one of the reasons you want to look at that first is just maybe fish are just moving across the landscape, right? I told you how much these fish move. Maybe they're just moving. And so we would expect that the places we've lost their presence, whoops, just yak too much, where we've lost their presence would be about similar to the place we've gained their presence if they're just moving around. But what we do see is that the places where that they've been extirpated, where they were found in 1992 but not found in 2012, is higher than where maybe they've colonized. And also we see higher rates of that site level extirpation at warmer sites than cooler sites. So we are seeing that, and that's completely associated in this basin with elevation, that these extirpation probabilities are higher at low elevations than at higher elevations. And in fact, at higher elevations, they're almost the same as our colonization probabilities. So we are seeing some indication of bull trout decreasing at the landscape scale, and it's associated with low elevation warm sites. Now, bull trout are still in the Bitterroot. Right? These are just small site level changes. They're still in every tributary that they were in 1992. We also looked at to see whether we saw higher probabilities of extirpation in burn sites, and the answer was not really. We saw bull trout, this is no fire, and this is fire. What happened to my error bars? Sorry, something happened. But they have pretty high error bars here, just so you know. But there was no significant difference between bull trout persistence in places that burned, sites that burned, had riparian burns, and sites that didn't. And that's something also Ron Pierce has seen in the Blackfoot. Up in the North Fork, the Blackfoot, Snowbank, Copper Creeks, these are sites that burn and have great bull trout populations. So burning isn't enough to have impacts on native fish. And one of the things we've done in the Bitterroot is go back to these sites and look at the whole fish community. And what's really been interesting about what's been happening since the 2000 fires at those sites is that bull trout haven't really changed in response to fire. Brook trout got initially knocked down and haven't responded, haven't been recovered except for one stream. And cutthroat are doing great. Their densities are higher than before the fire, and they're quickly rebounded and recovered at those sites. So as we're thinking about climate change, I would argue, we're looking, there's some pretty drastic predictions. The jury's still out. There's a lot that we don't know. But one of the things that we do know is how we make decisions in the future. In particular, we know there's going to be more competition for water. And how we respond is really going to change what happens. We can think about climate change, but how we're responding to this is really, I think, is going to have the biggest impact on fish communities. And so that leads us to next week's lecture, which is Marco talking about, are we running out of water? Challenges and opportunities for management of water in western Montana. And he's going to be talking about some of those trade-offs of how we're allocating water. As far as I know, that's what he's going to be talking about. I'm looking at Bill to see if he's shaking his head no or yes. All right. And so I want to thank all the graduate students. I put pictures up as I talked about their work throughout, as well as the broader fisheries community in the state, and then both Department of Ecosystem and Conservation Sciences and the Wildlife Biology program. And I will take any questions you guys have. What time is it? Oh, phew. I was trying to make sure it wasn't too long. Yeah.
Are there dams on the Yellowstone upstream from that intake that you showed? And if not, couldn't you just move a few pallid sturgeon above the dam? Would there be enough river above that?
They don't think, so where they think the spawn, they have moved pallid sturgeon above that, and they have found that they have spawned above that, so that's why they think that there's enough spawning habitat, or at least the cues for spawning there. The problem is that the offspring would just run into that that diversion dam as well. So you have to have not only just moving fish, but also the larval drift back. They can't be stopped. Yeah, but certainly being able to find a way for pallid sturgeon to move around that would be useful. But that also brings up a question: is larval have to be able to drift back past that site too? Yeah.
Any effort to restore the sturgeon in the west slope, Columbia, Clark Fork River?
So you're talking about not the pallid sturgeon.
No.
Okay. I'm like sitting here thinking, I was like, it wouldn't be the pallid sturgeon. Yeah. So there's a sturgeon in the Kootenai drainage, which they're are also focused on. And one of the things that, if you look at the Clark Fork, it's interesting. So historically, the Clark Fork hasn't been connected to the ocean, right? Because that's why we don't have anadromous fish, or even the red band rainbow, torrent sculpin, the sturgeon, the white sturgeon that's up in the Kootenai drainage, because that connection hasn't been there for thousands and thousands of years. So we don't have any of those fish. So in the Clark Fork, they're really focused on trout. Yeah. Yeah.
So it looks like from your talk, most of the spawning and reeling dynamics of trouts occur in the middle streams, second or third order tributaries. What about the main stem? Let's say if you talk about the Bitterroot watershed, because I'm working on the Bitterroot.
Yeah, brown trout spawn lower in the watershed. So the native fish tend to move into the tributaries and spawn and then move into the river. If you're looking at fish that are spawning in the rivers, there's a lot of fish that are spawning in the rivers. Brown trout will spawn in the rivers or in the low, very mouths of tributaries. Mountain whitefish will spawn in the rivers or in the low mouths of tributaries. All the suckers will spawn in the rivers. You know, this is something we were really focused on movement of trout past dams, but when we snorkeled the dams before we did this project just to see if there were actually any bull trout being stopped, for example, which would have killed the project if the answer was no, we ran into tons of suckers. So both large nose and large scale suckers are known to go on long migrations, and they spawn in the rivers. They're probably the largest biomass being stopped by dams in our rivers right now. But we're not moving suckers around or radio tagging suckers. Nobody wants to fund sucker research. But they are native suckers. Yeah, so there are a lot of fish that are spawning in the rivers as well. Yeah.
Reasons you would say that the main stem is also important for fish dynamics.
It is. So he asked if the main stem was also important, and certainly the main stem for some of these trout is most important for overwintering and feeding, but certainly the main stem and maintaining sort of substrate in that main stem is critical. Yeah.
You didn't mention much about the predation of pike. Is that not a big issue, or just something you didn't cover this time?
It's something I didn't cover this time. I think that predation of pike, so one of the things that, especially in the Clark Fork, before they were removing the Milltown Dam, there was a pike suppression program, and I don't even know who asked the question. Oh, sorry. So there was a pike suppression program, and because pike spawn a lot in the reservoirs, the Milltown Reservoir had a really fairly robust pike population. And so as juvenile trout were coming down, especially in the spring, they were just a conveyor belt of food and juvenile trout for pike consumption. And in particular, during those times of outmigration, David Schmetterling found really high proportions of trout in pike diets. And so certainly in that area where you have this sort of funneling of juvenile salmon into an area, that's going to be important. The other place that I think that folks have started to look at it is in the flathead below the lake. the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes have started looking at bass and pike to try to understand their densities and do some energetics modeling. We've done a little bit of modeling with them to try to look at how many trout are probably being consumed given pike diets. And so certainly some of these exotic predators in the rivers are going to be, can be important and can have pretty large impacts, yeah.
Hi. Mountain lakes, inasmuch as most mountain lakes are planted, and so there are really not native species there, what is your opinion of the logic of replacing productive fisheries in places, for instance, like the Jewel Basin, and turning them into pure cutthroat by, you know, annihilating the existing good fishery and trying to put in cutthroat?
Yeah, and so another controversial issue. Fisheries is so full of controversial issues. It's so exciting. So the issue is that there are some lakes that historically have been stocked, in particular with rainbow trout. And so in those lakes, they're primarily rainbow trout or hybrids, depending on the lake. They initially, in a lot of lakes, started stocking cutthroat trout, trying to just swamp out and transition those lakes. That worked in some cases and not in others. And so in watersheds where below the lake is pure cutthroat, they are doing what they call cutthroat restoration, which is going in and poisoning lakes and restocking them with cutthroat. And you know, I think that that's a tricky issue, because in some cases, if those lakes haven't leaked rainbows yet, maybe they are isolated. But they're trying to ensure and essentially, what I would say, protect that broader sort of population of cutthroat. I don't know. I see the reason I'd like to see it done on a small scale to really look at what's happening. There's some people who would argue if they were fishless lakes, they shouldn't even be restocked if they're in wilderness, right? So in the wilderness, they should just, if they were originally fishless, they should stay fishless, because there's frogs and there's invertebrates and there's all these other species that we find in fishless systems. So, you know, you can see the range of the arguments from keep it wilderness, the concept of wilderness, let's return this lake to the concept of wilderness, to let's, in these lakes where there are important fisheries resources, stock pure cutthroat so that we're conserving this broader population, and then the area that you don't want to disrupt a good fishery. And what I don't know is there are a lot of lakes that are good fisheries with just cutthroat. And so I don't know if, you know, there isn't a short-term loss for a long-term gain. And I think where they're trying some of this are in these regions where there are pure cutthroat across a broad landscape. And so they're just trying to keep that large-scale population intact. So I can see that argument. But I like to see it done, and again, like they do in many systems, they show a few successes, and then they say, this is what we're going to do over a broader scale, which is good. I think it helps people
Lisa?
feel better.
Sorry. Lisa, may
Yeah.
I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Hey, it's I.
I don't know, this light right here.
I know, it's really bad, isn't it? I wanted to ask Bill this last week. You talked about how you have a very broad tent of who you are, and you and your graduate students in your lab, and then all of the agencies with whom you work. How do you make contact with those agencies? How do you set up a relationship so that you work with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks or any of those other agencies? So that you do studies for them.
Right. So part of it's just, you know, meeting, so getting introduced at professional meetings and meeting them and talking with them. One of the things, because we actually have a very small fisheries program, is I really bring in our broader local community and education as well. And so, you know, our students do internships with them. We use my advanced fisheries class, we use local case studies. So Barry Hansen is coming down in a couple weeks to talk to the fisheries group and to our class to talk about Flathead Lake management. Another really controversial issue, if you would like that Barry Hanson's coming down to talk about it like in a couple weeks. And then we use their data set to evaluate it. So part of it's through training and education, and part of it's through professional meetings and just meeting with folks and saying, you know, this is what I'm interested in. I mean, just like writing proposals to broader funding agencies, you go to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, or you go and say, these are some really important issues for you. Don't you want to work on them? Or they might come after that and say, hey, we have some really important issues. Do you want to work with us on it? So once that initial relationship has been made, it's a two-way street.
So then do they tend to fund your work or support your work financially or not?
So
Depends.
some of these projects, the Clearwater was supported by, well, it was supported so you could track the money. So many energy companies have to pay states mitigation dollars. And so it was actually funded through mitigation dollars that funneled through Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So it's not your tax dollars at work. Don't worry. It's not your hunting registration fees. But they have access to pots of money, and so does the tribes. And so we work a lot with the tribes and with the Forest Service. And then there's some pots of money that we write competitive proposals for. Like all the Bitterroot stuff was a national competitive proposal. But even if we get outside money, we still work closely with the agencies.
Thank you.
I don't know. Bill, do you have a different answer? You just go and beg and plead? I know.
If there aren't any more questions right away, you'll think of some as you come down, so let's give Professor Eby another round of applause.